much.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. As Andrew mentioned, I'm an artist, conceptual artist, and a writer. And so the name of this, I guess the title of this talk is To Stall, Delay, and Invert, specifically because I think of those verbs and those actions as representative of certain tactics that I associate with Black resistance. And so I'm going to first kind of give an overview of my practice and how these terms are kind of showing up in my work, and then talk alongside Lindsey Berfond about the exhibition at the Queen's Museum. And so to start off, I always like to start artist talks with quotes. And in particular, I like to consider the words of writers that kind of influence my work in a lot of different ways. And so the first is by Toni Cade Bambara, who's a late scholar and activist and writer. And this is from an interview that she gave in which she spoke about her novel, The Salt Eaters. Fortunately, this text is really small on my screen, but so if I'm like squinting, that's why. But in this interview, she stated, quote, "That book taught me how to get well. I was writing beyond myself in that sense. Also in the sense that I was stretching, reaching, trying to do justice to that realm of reality that we all live in but do not acknowledge, because the English language is a mercantile business and not for the interior life." And then the second is by the late scholar James A. Sneed from his essay, his 1981 essay on repetition in Black culture, in which he wrote, quote, "Black culture, the thing, the ritual, the dance, the beat, is there for you to pick it up when you come back to get it. If there is a goal in such a culture, it is always deferred. It continually cuts back to the start. In the musical meaning of cut as an abrupt, seemingly unmotivated break, an accidental da capo with a series already in progress and a willed return to a prior series. Black culture in the cut builds accident into its coverage, almost as if to control their unpredictability. Itself a kind of cultural coverage, this magic of the cut attempts to confront accident and rupture not by covering them over, but by making room for them inside the system itself." And then the last is by the absolutely amazing poet Dionne Brand from her book, A Map to the Door of No Return, in which she wrote, quote, "Black experience in any modern city or town in the Americas is a haunting," end quote. So I'm sharing these writers to outline some of the central themes and problematics which permeate my practice. For me to take up Bambara's act of stretching and reaching to do what is right, to give voice to that realm of reality that we all live in but do not acknowledge, in other words, the interior, forces me to pose the question of what kinds of forms and methods could begin to do this slippery work of justice to nearly touch the complexities of Black interior life and intimate life. It forces me now to think about what forms can circumnavigate the limits of language and the boundaries of its narrative structures to make space for the dynamic systems that characterize that interior life. Similarly, this thing left there to pick up, as described by Sneed, is the literal call to arms in waiting of Blackness, the pause and delay that knows already a faltering that lives of and in the break, to reference Fred Moten, because these fractures, skips, and returns, these repetitions, are not only the interior components of a necessary system of survival, but in regard to Blackness, they are the system itself. And finally, how to engage in the intimate arenas of life, to return to those arenas again and again, while contending with the haunting of this environment of history within the aftermath of slavery, and what in life attempts to exceed it. So as a result of these framing questions, themes of collapse, refusal, and return permeate my work. My work is centrally concerned with tactics utilized by Black people to preserve Black life and the complexity and multiplicity which permeates that life. I'm interested in particular in maneuvers which employ intimacy as a counterbalance to the ways in which violence uses proximity as a central tool. My practice is informed by Black radicalizations of the cover, of repetition, and of stall and delay as tactics of conceptual abstraction which critically engage the delicate intimacies and reticent poetics underlying Black life. I'm interested in their worried notes, both inside and beyond the auditory, as mechanisms which counteract the insistence of anti-Black violence to deny and destroy. And so I like to start these talks with kind of earlier work, such as this piece, which is from a 2015 photographic series, photo and text series. Went too fast, sorry. Because it kind of illuminates some of the things that I'm thinking about in relationship to language. I'm centrally interested in the ways in which the symbolic realm of language delimits and fortifies the justification and reproduction of systemic anti-Blackness. As a way to kind of contend with that, I use autobiographical poetic fragments intertwined with fictional or historical texts to reimagine and posit Black interior life as a central site of Black resistance. I'm most excited by writing that jumps across and through temporal landscapes, insofar as it allows for event, person, and affect to be situated within varied spatial fields in a way that represents the broad and wide dispersal of Blackness, memory, and meaning. And so this idea is expressed through my use of disparate photographs alongside these semi-autobiographical text fragments, such as in this series. I predicate my exploration of language on the belief that within the infinite opaqueness and liquidity of a poetics emerging from Blackness, words shatter, phrases fragment, and meaning slips. And it's this entropic capacity of language that has the capacity to rupture the boundaries of established meaning and dominant thought, which reinforce systems of violence and oppression. And so this, like I mentioned, was an earlier series where I was combining text and photographs. And as I kind of continued to move through this series and these ideas, it developed into a more expansive use of image and text, and then alongside an incorporation of glass, such as in this piece entitled "An Immaterial Imaginary Rhythm Moistened Black Salt into Translucence." And in this piece, I explore ideas of Black mourning, loss, and remembrance, and my incorporation of glass alongside text and photograph was kind of opened up or added this additional layer of risk and fragility that both spoke to the conditions of Black life, but also manipulates the ground of word and image and their histories. And so one of the things that I kind of developed in creating this piece was that I wanted to think more about ways to represent this idea of repetition in Black culture. And so as a result, I developed this methodology of reusing materials from past work to formulate the next. And that also includes kind of revisiting installations to kind of expand some of the central questions and problematics that characterize that prior work. So this is a detail of the immaterial, and then, as I mentioned, so there's this kind of text element that's embedded within that piece, and so I'll read just the first. I won't read the whole thing because it's pretty long, but I'll just read the first section. I cried into the body of a someone gone in another way, a someone presently behind my eyes, my retina, who is as translucent as the one my mother was then and now, in resistance to mourn. And so this is an example of this kind of repetition and return to a prior work. This is an installation that was on view at Bard College upstate, part of the exhibition Black Melancholia. And this piece was kind of like a reprisal, rearticulation of that past, the prior installation that I just shared. This one is entitled Of the Immaterial Black Salt Translucence. And as in the prior installation, it also included photography, text, and glass. And I should also mention that both installations take a portion of their title from Edward Glissant's collection of poems entitled Le Ciel Noir. So similar to the original, this installation layers disparate photographs with a poetic text exploring mourning, time, and memory. And the text is printed on vellum and placed between layers of glass. For this installation, I reworked the original text and added a series of glass sculptures that were both etched with text, and then also they also had photographic decals that were placed onto the surface of the glass. The installation is supported by a series of handmade wooden benches produced by my father. And this is a gesture that references a prior installation that both he and I collaborated on in 2015. That was called The Red Book of Houston, a compendium for the new Black metropolis, which was exhibited at Project Row Houses. So taken together, what I'm trying to do with this installation is use different instances of repetition, enfoldment, and opacity to explore the interstices of Black intimacies, loss, and historicity. And so here is an example of that text that's been reworked. And just as like a comparison, I'll just read the first section of this. I cried into a body gone to flesh, then into its gone flesh, then into its barrenness, nestled within its still life, sliding along the translucence of the sclera. I cried into an overflow, into my mother's overburden, into my mother's resistance, then and now to more. And so for the past few years, I've been working quite a bit with glass, exploring the kind of different conceptual and formal possibilities of the material. I've been particularly interested in its contradictions, its transparency obstructed by its tendency towards translucent opacity, its rigidity thwarted by its capacity for shatter and violence on the body, and its malleability only accessible through a turn to a prior state of molten liquidity. And so all of these contradictions for me have come to encapsulate both the risk of anti-Black violence and the capacity for Blackness to transform, to abstract, and to reemerge in the face of, and most importantly, in spite of that violence. And so this installation was an attempt to kind of contend with these seemingly incongruent characteristics alongside the conditions of Black life. This installation is balanced only by the cinder blocks that are beside the sheets of glass, and then the ground of or kind of foundation of the installation is a layer of transparency photograph and then glass again, so it has this kind of slippery, unstable quality. And so in order to read the text, one must risk destabilizing the entire framework of the piece itself. And if you choose to take this risk, you're met with a eulogy and archive of remembrance. So I won't ask you guys to read all of this, so. And so I like to, so obviously you can see this piece did collapse during the course of its display. But I feel like I think that the collapse is an important element within the work. So I always display both the before and after. And then this is a more recent iteration of that installation, which I was a part of an exhibition that I did at Recess. I think it was feels like it was just yesterday, but it was last year. And so I'm sharing this as a kind of comparison of this kind of return to work. The difference, as you can see, there's no, there aren't photographs embedded within this piece, but there is a piece, I don't know if you can see my cursor, you can't. There is a piece of glass that's etched with text that's embedded in the back of this piece, which you could actually walk into. And similar to the other piece, this one did collapse. But again, this process, these two states of being of this piece is very important. Oftentimes I use historical artifacts and material as a starting point for my work. The historical artifacts I examine reveal the ways in which, under the current symbolic order, the position of the Black subject unjustly translates and transmits from person to property and from freedom to commodity. For me, these metonymic acts of reuse and rearticulation allow me to both highlight and disorder this transmutation. This piece is part of a series that I did in 2019 entitled Meta-Narratives. And it was made alongside a sound-based installation where I won't go into that piece, but for this piece I etched poems derived from fragments of David Walker's An Appeal and Four Articles, which was published in 1829, and Frederick Douglass's speech, The Meaning of the 4th of July for the Negro, which he gave in 1852. And so I took fragments from both of those texts and formulated my own text that was meant to kind of think about the ways in which some of the critiques that they were staging are still alive and present and necessary right now. And so those elements were etched onto the surface of the glass and alongside photographs, which are from that prior 2015 photographic series that I mentioned earlier. And so by making these gestures and these kind of layerings of material, what I was trying to do was kind of collapse the socio-spatial boundaries of Walker and Douglass's mutual critique of Americanized Enlightenment ideals by inserting my own interpretation. I used the enfoldment and layering of glass to articulate the ways in which Blackness in the history of modern slavery disorients and puts pressure on American conceptions of freedom, property, and personhood. So in doing this series, what kind of opened up for me was a desire to kind of explore the possibilities the capacity of the fold as a means by which to cultivate a black space within a space, a kind of heterotopia. I also began to think at this point more deeply about the ways in which the material and symbolic history of glass is also ensnarled by this kind of environment that we're living in and the history of transatlantic slavery. And so this, at that point, I kind of began to do more research onto the history of glass. And so this series represents my initial formulations of what is now my ongoing research into the ways in which glass as architectural and surveillance material creates encounters of perceived visibility, intimacy, and power. The work arising from this research examines how the symbolic and literal deployments of glass within the context of architecture, media, policing, and surveillance complicate Black intimacies and interiors and reify anti-Black protocols of movement and sightseeing. And through the use of text exploring intimacy and power strategically placed beneath and between the fold, this work examines and tries to explore the possibilities of a resistance forged within Black intimate terrains. And so, as I mentioned, this piece is part of a broader series that represents the kind of initial formal iterations of this research, in which I focus on text and enfoldment specifically. And more recent sculptures incorporate archival photographs from Black protests across history, which leads me into the work that's currently on view at the Queens Museum. But before we get into that work, I'm going to give you guys some context for the exhibition. On April 4th, 1964, the Brooklyn and Bronx branches of the Congress of Racial Equality, also known as CORE, led by Brooklyn Chairman Isaiah Brunson, announced their intentions to stall hundreds of cars along the access roads and highways leading to the much anticipated 1964-1965 New York World's Fair, located on the grounds of what is now the Queens Museum in Corona Park. This proposed gesture of resistance, meant to represent the ways in which white supremacy prohibits Black life, was met with immediate, widespread backlash from media outlets, government officials, as well as other civil rights activists. Then Mayor Robert F. Wagner Jr. declared the activists had, quote, put a gun to the heart of the city, end quote. Both the Bronx and Brooklyn chapters were expelled from the National Core, expelled by National Core's chairman, James Farmer, who later staged a counter-protest to the stalling in the form of a picket on the day of the fair. And so you can see on the left is the poster that the local core branches distributed, announcing the stalling. And then on the right is the counter protest that was staged by, it's the poster for the counter protest that was staged by the National Core branch. Because of the intense backlash that the local chapters received, including the passing of a law which made it illegal to run out of gas on the freeway, ultimately Isaiah Brunson failed to obtain the number of participants he had desired for the stall-in. As a result, at the time, the stall-in was considered a political failure by many. However, although the stall-in never took place as it was originally conceived, CORE was successful in disrupting, even if only temporary, the fair and the city's psychological landscape. The tens of thousands of would-be fairgoers who had come to, quote, the world of fantasy, end quote, were instead made to encounter the world of fact, which is a quote from then Police Commissioner Murphy. Sorry, I don't know what his first name was. And so, I wanted to share some of the press that the stall-in received, which was quite a bit. It was covered rather extensively by the New York Times, Life magazine, and kind of became a national, I guess took the national stage in a way. But so in kind of learning of this history, what I became interested in was trying to create or think about this act of pausing as a radical gesture. And so the exhibition at Queens kind of brings together works which represent my attempts to critically engage the radical possibilities that are encapsulated by coerce, threat, to stall, to pause, to withhold passage through. And so in order to think about this, I considered a number of materials and sources, such as, for instance, I was very much thinking about Philip Johnson's Tint of Tomorrow, which is, and Lindsey and I will talk more about that, but he built the Tint of Tomorrow as part of the New York State Pavilion at the World's Fair. And so I wanted to kind of engage with his complicated history within the context of, not just architecture, but also his complicated relationship with, or it's not even complicated, the fact that he was a Nazi supporter. Yep. But I wanted to kind of engage with the fact that this is somebody who, had a huge impact on American architecture and even architecture in a broader sense, which I'm sure that we'll talk about more later. And so here are some images of his Tint of Tomorrow, which, and this is specifically the terrazzo floor that adorned the base of the Tint of Tomorrow, which was, and this floor was a map of the state of New York, which was sponsored by Texaco. And then one of the works, other kind of elements that I was thinking about quite a bit, I was doing a lot of research on Richard Serra at the time, and I began to think a lot about his piece, Delineator from 1965. And for those who aren't familiar, Delineator consists of two-ton steel panels positioned one above the other. The piece, according to Serra, quote, as this is me quoting him, the piece tends to turn you, and the piece reframes the room in a way you would not have comprehended if the piece was, say, a painting on the wall. It's called Delineator because it delineates the volume of that rectilinear room. You're walking into a room that is the space that the sculpture defines. And so I was really interested in the ways in which he's thinking about this capacity for sculpture to transform architecture, but also to announce the kind of different elements that we don't think about within the context of architecture, like our relationship and the way that we're situated within it. And so that finally brings me to the exhibition that's currently on view at the Queens Museum. And in order to continue this conversation, I'd like to introduce the amazing Lindsey Berfond, who curated the exhibition. Lindsey is an assistant curator and studio manager at the Queens Museum, where she has organized and supported a range of exhibitions and public programming with artists, thinkers, cultural producers, and communities. She's co-curated Queens International 2016, the 7th iteration of the museum's biannual exhibition of Queens-based artists, and recently curated the Queens Jerome Foundation Fellowship exhibitions by Alexandria Smith and Asif Mian. Lindsey earned her BA in Art History from NYU and her MA from the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College. She has contributed to exhibitions and other programming at institutions such as Art in General, Nurture Art, and Sculpture Center. So if you all
got a full bio moment. All right, let's talk about these works.
Yeah.
So thank you for having me, Bard Graduate Center, and Charisse. But yeah, so this exhibition by Charisse Pearlina Weston has a great title and a long one that we often return to. It's called Of a Tomorrow, Lighter Than Air, Stronger Than Whiskey, Cheaper Than Dust. It's a 2-gallery exhibition, and Charisse did a great job of kind of setting the framework, which is complex, of the show and really ties both to the site of the museum and histories or lineages of Black resistance throughout the exhibition. But, you know, one of the main objects in the show is a very large scale presentation. It's about a 15-foot by 20-foot glass installation that does the act that Charisse was talking about, right? It enacts that idea of to stall, to delay, to withhold passage through, quite literally, as we can see here. So this glass installation, basically so you can orient yourself when you kind of see the main wall text. You know, when you go to an exhibition, it talks about Charisse and her work, you walk through the door, and this is immediately what you see. The second part of the exhibition is just through that doorway, and that's a second gallery of sculptures that Charisse did for the show. But this sculpture is impeding that. You cannot walk through the gallery into the next part of the exhibition. You have to turn around where you encounter another series of works and walk around it. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the making of this monumental work, a work that is semi-transparent, that has that active transparency, but really is a blockade. It's enacting what core intended to do, right, in a lot of ways. And yeah, I was thinking about just maybe if you could talk to a little bit about your approach, because I think it both is embodied in the sense of the delineator, right, in Richard Serra. It's embodied in the sense of being asked to slow down very explicitly, but it's also very psychological in that you can see a reflection in it, and it kind of upends and changes the space. So maybe you want to talk to, like, when you were conceiving of learning about the history of core, combining the Richard Serra influence. What drew this shape? It has a very minimalist quality to it as well, but it's quite, you feel small next to it for sure. I know it's hard with a photo, but yeah. Yeah,
I feel like as soon as I was kind of doing research on core, and I think as soon as I saw that there was an attempt to do a stall-in in that specific way, it's almost like immediately I knew what I wanted to, because I think I told you very early on, I was like, this is the piece.
Yep.
So I think it was, and also because it kind of ties so much into the work that I've already been doing, and the fact that I've been thinking about stall and delay in different ways within my practice. I think that it was kind of one of those moments where I feel like there wasn't as much, I don't know how to describe it. It was like an immediate, like, I knew it.
I think we sketched it like onto an image, like of just a snapshot of the galleries. It was a kind of an immediate thing, and I think there is both a poetics, but there's also something, that I wanted to talk about with the work, which is, slowing, as you saw in Charisse's practice, there's a sense of slowing down, creating spaces of intimacy, withholding, also opacity, even using a medium that's transparent. That's an ongoing thread. And here, intimacy is both a site for resistance, right? It's a countermeasure to protect Black interior life, but it also holds the contradictions, complexity in relation to architecture. So despite the association of glass with transparency and access, it's also very restrictive when it's tied to ideologies and structures of surveillance, of hypervisibility. We talked a lot about methods of regulating order, right, that control the equilibrium, but that often enact anti-Black violence in themselves. So I'm curious, like, a lot of the works in the show hold all these conceptual layers at once, and how you thought about it in relation to working at this like very large scale in glass, and kind of, because there is that sense of risk is still there, just much bigger.
I think that's one of the reasons why I was interested in, I guess one of the initial ideas that I had was that I wanted it to have this sense of like almost being in a state of collapse, to kind of engage with that idea of risk, of like the kind of potentiality of, literally collapse.
Right.
And also, since I've been working with glass, there's oftentimes this disbelief that the material that I'm using is glass. And I find that to be really interesting, in that there's this kind of resistance to kind of see the material for what it is. It's always like a conception that it might be something else. And yeah, does that kind of answer your question? Sorry.
And I also want to backtrack a little bit. I'm thinking now, because we talked about the title of the show, which is also the title of this work. And maybe we should also set the stage by talking about that title and how it came to be. So, Of a Tomorrow, thinking about Tomorrowland, the tent of tomorrow, these kind of ideas of fantasy, futurity, progress, power, as they were encompassed in the history of the 1964 to 1965 World's Fair. And then the rest of the quote, lighter than air, the rest of the title, lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, cheaper than dust. You want to start? Talk a little bit about that?
So I showed you all that Texaco flooring, or Texaco sponsored flooring in the Tent of Tomorrow.
Which was like a roadmap, basically, of New York State.
Yeah. So in doing research, in the process of doing research, I started to do research on the founders of Texaco, and found that one of them was essentially a barbed wire tycoon. He owned a kind of monopoly on barbed wire.
Yep.
And his company essentially popularized that material to the point that it changed American rural landscape. Because prior to this, people didn't really create boundaries between their private property and other property.
Very American.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so I was interested again in thinking about this idea of the kind of boundaries that are created by different types of architecture, and thinking about this idea of barbed wire creating these, lines in space that didn't exist there prior to that. And so it made sense to kind of merge those two ideas of ideas of the future that are tied with a kind of an oppressive regime.
Yep.
Alongside, ideas of landscape and boundaries. And
the quote, the second part of the title is actually a quote, lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, cheaper than dust, is how this tycoon, who later went on to be a co-founder of Texaco, how they referred to barbed wire, right? Which I think there's a slipperiness in so much of your work when thinking about architecture, and there's a very strange slipperiness in how this person was describing a material that is so violent in a lot of ways, right, and how it relates to space. Lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, cheaper than dust. He was trying to tout it. in this way, which I think is a lot of like how America or progress or the conception of the future was touted in the World's Fair. And when we think about those mapping, Robert Moses's infrastructural planning is had incredibly racist implications in this city. So there's like a interesting interplay between that kind of that darkness in our history too.
And that, of course, that Robert Moses was like the organizer of the fair. Of
the 64 World's Fair. Folks don't know for sure. But I also want to take that moment to talk about something that we talk about a lot, that this exhibition is not about the World's Fair, right? It's using, I think you heard something I heard you say quite a bit in your presentation is a lot of your work is a tactic, right? There are tactics, and the Stalin and that history of the Stalin and the history embedded in this site is a tactic for understanding this work. It's to reorient these protocols of white supremacy. So I wonder if we want to talk about that a little bit too, like how for you the history of the World's Fair sits when you're thinking about this work, because I also want to talk about the other work in this gallery, which is a series of etchings that also draw from an archive of this work too.
Sorry, could you ask what was the question?
Of course. No, thinking about the way how the World's Fair sits for you when thinking about this work. It's not about the World's Fair, but it's using this Stalin history as a tactic in a way, as a starting point, right, for understanding. For orienting the viewer, reorienting the viewer and how they engage with that history too.
Yeah.
For sure.
And it's kind of similar to what I mentioned with the way that I like to engage with historical objects is that it's not so much about the work being a kind of didactic that presents this object that you might not know about. It's more so about using that as a foil to then stage a critique of some of the ways in which those issues of the past are still very much present and live, in the contemporary. And so that's the way that I was kind of approaching my engagement with the World's Fair, is that it's not so much that I'm like super excited about the fair itself, but it's more so about core and this radical gesture of pause that they were kind of demanding.
And we talked so much about how, like, what's so radical about it, right? Like, what's so radical about asking folks to slow down and confront these structural racism that's in our city, but was met with such derision and such violence in and of itself. Like, what they were asking for was fair housing, integrated and quality public schools, a civilian review board for cases of police brutality, and non-discrimination in employment. How many of those things are we still dealing with today? So I think it's really interesting to think about that and how the Stalin was received as a moment of pause versus how the counter-protest picketing was received, which was still not great and still pretty met with resistance on the police force, but was somehow more permissible than asking folks to slow down. But just moving on from there, and I want to talk about these two canvas prints and etchings that are in the piece. It's a diptych that basically you walk in, you encounter the large-scale suspended glass piece, you turn around and you encounter this diptych of an etching that Charisse has created for the exhibition as well. It's titled "This World's in a Tangle." Got news this morning. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you were talking about reusing works, parts of works that have collapsed into other works. So maybe you could reintroduce this etching process here.
So these are a part of a series that I've been working on for the past couple of years called Canvases, and they are produced from essentially the documentation of my installations that I render black and white, print onto canvas, and then etch with the broken shards from broken work, or collapsed pieces like the pieces that I showed you earlier. So I've been doing different iterations of these pieces. I'm going to skip that and come back to it. But there you can kind of get a little bit more detail into the etching. So for I guess the difference with these pieces is that it incorporates a copper etching that I did that's a kind of like abstract image of a familial loss, and it's layered alongside a map that I found in the New York Times that depicts a member of the National Corps branch marking locations for their protests, and this is the counter-protest to the Stalin. And so I use this map as the foundation for the diptych, which I, again, etched with broken glass. And there's some detail images.
Yeah, there's something to also like in different areas of the etching, there's almost like a more pressure applied, where you could see the fraying coming in. And I think about these fissures, right? Like about between the Stalin and the counter protest of the World's Fair by the National Corps, which is shown, the map is in this etching, about like how that kind of putting two parts of the organization against one another, pitting them against one another, and one when they were really asking for very similar things is also like a reflection of white supremacy in and of itself, right? And I think that fraying, that repetitive additional pressure, that it came up for me a lot when looking at this work, and something I think is in one of the images that we showed is that it's actually that etching is reflected onto the surface of the first work in the gallery. So there's a direct relationship there that kind of is thinking about this entanglement between these two protests. And of course, like the structure of white supremacy, which undergirds so many of our systems and the World's Fair. But I also really wanted to talk about something that's not in many of our didactics, but that the fact that your canvas works of these are always titled after blues songs. And this one's titled after one, This World's in a Tangle. And thinking about the way in which the reuse of materials and returning back to them in other works is kind of thinking about the cover in blues music, and how you talked about the way in which it kind of releases an emergent originality, right? And I'm thinking also about the Sneed quote at the beginning of your presentation too. And I just wonder about your relationship to the blues, thinking about how the blues is a way of like collective or communal storytelling in this piece.
I've always had a huge love for blues. I'm from Houston, which has its own complex history with engagement with blues, and I've always been very excited by the ways in which you can listen to one song by one artist and listen to the exact same song, same title, same lyrics, and it's a categorically different song. And it's something that I find completely unique to blues music, because everything else can be the same arrangement, everything, but it's totally different. And that was kind of an early way that I became interested in this idea of repetition and of the cover as a tactic of resistance, because there's these kind of moments of originality that are embedded within these different formulations or different versions. And so I've kind of like brought that into my practice in different ways, not in terms of music, but in terms of like the kind of formal approaches that I take within the work.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and I think there's something really interesting. I was listening to The World's in a Tangle a few nights ago, recorded by Lightning Hopkins in the 60s, but also Jimmy Rogers, and they talk about, that's why I'm going to build myself a cave, move down into the ground, and thinking about the sense of interiority and intimacy in your work. So I thought that was really, I was returning to it and listening to it over again too.
Yeah, and that's also I think that's one of the things that I come back to a lot with blues, is that it is so much about the interior. About different kinds of intimacies that I feel like in a lot of instances Black people weren't allowed to express.
Right.
Yeah.
But let's talk about Gallery 2, an incredible series of sculptures in this gallery the last gallery, which, basically as these works, there are 8 works in this show, in this part of the show, that are taking as a starting point different moments of source material, also taken from archives, from the Queens Museum archive included, newspapers and articles, Life magazine, New York Times, also are important in this show. As a starting point, thinking about, of course, the core protests, the 64-65 World's Fair in these works, as well as the Watts Uprising in Los Angeles, which was the following year in 65, and the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests throughout the United States. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit to this kind of the way in which you started with these works and choosing these particular punctuations in history of Black resistance movements as related to the glass works that you were creating here, maybe as a starting point to talking about this gallery.
My interest in kind of looking at these different materials comes from that earlier research that I mentioned, where I was thinking about this kind of material history of glass in relationship to architecture and surveillance. And I started off by kind of looking at the broken windows theory as a kind of articulation of these kind of a symbolic register of glass in which is deployed specifically to kind of reify anti-Black protocols. And so kind of doing research around the broken windows theory, I began to think about the ways in which some of the ideas that are expressed within the broken windows theory kind of expand out into the ways in which Black protests is covered by media outlets. And there's this very specific repetition of language, of images, specifically of broken glass, damaged property, that shows up over and over again across time. And so I wanted to kind of take those images and kind of think about them alongside the Stalin, and kind of try to use different processes to kind of manipulate them and invert the kind of insidious kind of use that they originally had. Yeah,
and that idea of kind of vulnerability or risk in glass is also like there's a second layer of in the image itself, and how that image is deployed to in media narratives. But I wondered if we could stick on the images for a minute, because I think I'm really interested in the way in which the images are not kind of just like an image of the piece of broken glass in a direct way. You're always kind of reframing, fragmenting, inverting, or disoriented the source material you're getting, whether it's from Life magazine or New York Times or from a permanent collection. And there's like an intentionality in your approach to these images that are associated with violence to not, very, very specifically not reproduce that violence, right? But to intervene in it, or disrupt the viewer's ability to digest, to slow down again in that work. So I wonder if you could speak to that part of your process when you're kind of in the making of these works, where there's a process of fusing, right, the image to the work, that sense of disrupting, breaking apart, or disordering the images. I know there's a few different examples of that in the show as well.
Yeah. Let me see if I can find. So yeah, I think that at least in terms of like not trying to reproduce images of violence, I feel like that's a conversation that I've had a lot with fellow artists that I am in conversation with, that's kind of something that we're always considering, even right. So trying to find ways to kind of speak to this environment that we live in, and this constant risk and presence of violence, but not becoming an agent within that violence, if that makes sense. Yep. And so some of the methods that I'm using are like enfoldment, layering, different acts of concealment, And so, for instance, in this piece, you can kind of see that the front part of this piece is kind of concealing the image that's behind it.
There's also ways in which, in a lot of the images that you're showing, in moments of interaction with the police, for instance, for images, there are these really haunting negatives from our collection that show the protests at the World's Fair by the core contingent. Some of them are known that, basically, when the Stalin could not happen as planned, many protesters from the Stalin contingent protested on the 7 train at the Jackson Heights stop and physically tried to blockade people from getting in and out of the door. And there are ways in which that image is kind of broken apart or layered in the work to kind of like almost distance from it. There's also images that you have here of folks being arrested by the police, but you invert the image in a way so that they're almost floating away if they're inverted away from the police as opposed to being pulled down. Or the arrest of Isaiah Brunson, who was the chairman of the core Brooklyn contingent, who organized the World's Fair, kind of like layering that so, it's a moment of violence in which he's being arrested, but he almost cascades down. And I think there's a really interesting way in which you approach the images there. Yeah, like this one.
Let me see if I have that other one. I don't know. I don't think I've put it in here.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, and that's similar to the images that I use within the 2020, or from the 2020 protests. I really did not want to have people in those images. Right. So I used different tactics of breaking up the image, such as in this one, or literally taking elements of the image and breaking it apart even more, such as in this piece.
Yeah. And I wonder, the last thing I was hoping we could talk about was the way in which action is really important in these works. There's the act of enfolding, right? Keeping distance or secreting away or making interior. There's the language, right? The way in which you also are etching into a lot of these pieces. And then there's the layer of action and kind of like the base of each one, which are lead and concrete in the works. I wonder if you could talk to that, like the idea of withholding or distancing is so important in these works, and you have a variety of different methods for doing it to make intimacy and interior in pieces that are in a transparent medium and layering with the images too. So maybe we could talk about one or use it as like a jumping off point. It's hard to choose. There are 8 incredible works that I invite you to see at the museum. But also, this one is incredible and has that incredible text piece in it too that kind of ties into it. And maybe we can end in there.
So there's different elements within this piece. As you mentioned, there's a lot of etching. And what I'm interested in terms of the using glass as a substrate is the ways in which, obviously because it's transparent, the text can be inverted very easily. And I kind of play with that based on like the kind of positioning of the text and using the fold to kind of flip the text itself or leave it inverted, or using the text to kind of block out certain sections. And so, and I should also mention, so this image is from the core protest that you mentioned. It's one of the negatives that I found in the Queens Museum's archive. And what I wanted to do with this image, because the negatives themselves are so haunting and also just slightly difficult, or rather difficult to kind of register when you first look at them, I decided to leave the negatives as is, so that there would be this kind of delay in kind of registering what's happening in the image. And that's similar to the ways in which I kind of etch the text. In some instances, it has this kind of enamel that brightens the text so that you can read it. In other instances, the text nearly disappears. yeah, and so I think that speaks to this kind of wanting to force the viewer to kind of pause and also be frustrated by not having access to everything that's there.
Every single word, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, what's interesting here is you've continued to kind of use source material in the text in different ways. In this piece, I know it's kind of a mix of different things. You're taking, but making it into a new kind of poetic exploration between the, wording from the two posters that we saw of the protest and counter-protest at the beginning, taking from quotes from the police commissioner and mayor, who were quoted quite frequently in the New York Times complaining about the threat of the Stalin, which is its power, kind of psychological power. But lastly, something really interesting, which is the Frank O'Hara poem, which I didn't know about until we spoke. But here in New York, we were having a lot of trouble with the World's Fair. So it was a poem that Frank O'Hara wrote at the time, talking specifically about the Stalin. So I think there's such an interesting way in which you're kind of combining all of these aspects, and doing that work and kind of making those poetics, but also concealing it at the same time. Mm-hmm. When you were kind of gathering all those materials, how was the approach in kind of creating that and kind of figuring out how to place it in the work?
I feel like I'm kind of like a frantic researcher and gatherer. I just kind of whenever it makes reading things very difficult, because when I see one reference, I have to go and read that, and then I have to come back, and it's like a long process. Yeah. So I gathered a lot of material, and it's shown up in different ways throughout the work. So I'm happy you're here to remind me all the stuff that's in here. Yeah. But oftentimes especially when I'm engaging with text like the Frank O'Hara piece, I take fragments, or there's certain fragments that stand out to me, and they kind of, I guess, become the basis for opening up a kind of new text that I write kind of independently. And luckily, in this instance, like you mentioned, there was so much material coverage from the New York Times and Life magazine, so I kind of was able to take a lot of different fragments from those different sources and develop a ton of writing, which kind of showed up in these pieces in different ways.
In almost all of them, I think. And there's also something to be said for, I think we were both pretty, not shocked, but sitting with the anti-Black language that was in a lot of that reporting around the Stalin, and using this moment to kind of upend that, but also really interestingly hide it in different ways. So something that I think only you know and our registrar knows is kind of that there is text also embedded in some of the lead works that you can't see at all, but is kind of within the presence of the work, which I find really interesting too.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to what I mentioned before of thinking about the fold as an instance where I can create these interior spaces and moments where kind of articulation of Black interior life can live without this risk of exposure. And again, this speaks to my interest in withholding as a tactic of resistance.
Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, sure.
That'll be all right. If anyone has any questions.
Oh, yes, please. Hi, Charisse. This is great, and having been able to listen to you speak about your earlier work yesterday is really nice. But I wanted to go back to the two pieces of your earlier work that you showed that they kind of before and after of the collapse.
Oh, yeah.
And kind of how they might relate to this exhibition. But a question I just had about the kind of intentionality of setting up pieces of glass in a precarious way so that they would collapse, and how much the viewer is part of that collapse, or if at some point they collapse on their own because of gravity. Because there is a sense of anxiety that comes with knocking something over, or seeing glass pieces that are almost, it feels very kinetic to me, like there's so much movement in the work. There's still that they're about to do something possibly, and then they collapse. And In this piece, it feels like a version of that where it's so it's so big, and it's almost like watching something falling in slow motion. And there's some kind of a visceral sense of anxiety that goes along with that. And I guess my question is really about how much does anxiety sort of, is that an intentional part of what these pieces are getting at, and whose anxiety is the case? Because I'd love to see this in person, but you walk in and it's not only stalling and preventing you from moving through, but it's in and of itself, it feels like something about to happen, like that, the pregnant pause, and so that's.
Yeah. I should note that like those pieces that collapse, I never set them up to collapse. The intention is that they don't.
Okay.
But I've made a point to never go back and kind of fix them after they've collapsed. I kind of view this as like its state now, and that is the piece. I really like the question of like the anxiety aspect. I think that even though I never really talk about anxiety, because I'm interested in thinking about the risk that this material, or sense of risk that it imparts, that anxiety is a part of the work. I think that in terms of whose anxiety, I think that I'm thinking about, the anxiety that, of being Black in this country, and not just this country, but like more broadly, being Black in this kind of world and environment that we're living in. And so I guess there's an aspect of the work where I'm trying to kind of definitely not make Black folks anxious, but I'm interested in making that anxiety live in a different way.
In a subversive way.
Yeah.
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 Thank you.
I think that works. I really appreciate that.
Okay.
I think, particularly with the fold, I wouldn't describe folding the glass as therapy,
Right.
because it has its own set of anxieties, because there's so much that can happen. Obviously glass doesn't want to be folded. And so it is constantly resisting those kinds of gestures. And I think that one thing that I've learned in working with glass in this way is that I kind of have to be open to the possibilities and to let the material kind of lead me a little bit, even though I hate that in the moment when it's trying to lead me. But I guess I'm also, you can't be working with this material without being excited by that sense of chance. Because there's certain pieces in the show that I had conceived in a certain way, and then they came out completely different, but they actually kind of ended up being better than I could have hoped, such as this one. And so there's a part of something that I do in the work is oftentimes I produce the elements separated, so that there's kind of like this possibility to modulate different sheets with, essentially combine different sheets with other sheets. And so that kind of, I guess, mediates the ways in which like I have this resistance from the material, because that means that kind of opens up a lot of different possibilities of how things can be configured and also reconfigured, which also ties to my interest in like the possibility of work being able to show up in other pieces. Sorry, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. That was amazing.
There's also something so haptic about that fold, the way in which you do the fold in the kiln.
Yeah.
Also, another way in which the glass is, in these sculptures I use, there's both the folding and there's slumping, right, where there's a form and the glass kind of gravity goes onto the form that I think also has that kind of haptic energy that I think you might have been teeing on to, for sure.
Yeah. Thank you for this. I have sort of 2 or 1.5 questions. But my first is basically like, what happens to these pieces after they've been disassembled, deactivated, broken? Can you reactivate them? Do you sell them? Like, what is the afterlife of a piece in exhibition? And I guess that's my 1.5 questions.
So specifically the pieces that break?
Well, all of them.
All of them.
Yeah.
I mean, oftentimes I reuse some elements in new work, especially if it's like part of an installation. Like that first earlier installation that I showed that was on view at Bard includes elements from another installation. I guess, I do sell some of them, but I think I guess you're more interested in like this kind of activation of the piece afterwards.
Because with conceptual art, like if you have a concept, can you re-realize it after it's been disassembled?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a kind of central component of my work is that, I mean, I don't think of particularly the installations as ever being finished. And so I'm interested in this idea that the kind of thread or question of the work can be extended into the next piece. And so that's why I kind of use these different elements from past work as like almost a extension of the kind of historicity of the art object.
Oh, thanks for both your talks. I was just really struck by the kind of sense of time and temporality and your use of glass and how, because I write a little bit about silicon sometimes, and that's kind of derived from sand, basically. Glass is related to sand, and just like the sort of time and grains of sand like running through like an hourglass almost, and how your work has this kind of layering of time and freezing of time in a way, and just thinking about like the palimpsest in the city and the space that you're working in and how you're reflecting on things that have happened geographically in the location. And I really like the sort of movement of the glass, the way it flows and everything. And I was just wondering, is this something that you conceived specific? I mean, I know you made it specifically for the space, but let's say, you know, you were at a different space, would you have worked with the sort of temporality, you know, the space there as well? Is that a theme that's in your work? Is it very site-specific often?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that site specificity is important to me. Kind of goes back to like some of my earlier installations that were, when I was living in Houston, very specific to like certain histories in Houston, thinking about like freeways and things like that, specifically that were constructed through Black neighborhoods. And so that's kind of like, I feel like the beginning of my work with installation. So I feel like that's something that I always kind of go back to and engage with in some way. So yeah, in the next place, I'll do the same thing.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here today. First, yes, let's